Well, the last video got cut off, but we're going to pick up where we left off, still with the SPARS pandemic exercise. But I want to first precede that with just a summary of whenever they do these kinds of exercises, tabletop exercises or drills or what have you, eventually what follows is the reality of that thing, which is why we're going to address Event 201, which was one of these exercises that took place in October, I believe, of 2019, just a couple months, 2 months really, before the authorities that became aware of COVID-19. Interesting timing. Also, we have the Crimson Contagion drill, and this was an actual drill rather than just a tabletop exercise, detailing the same scenario. What do we do when a terrible pandemic hits? And in short order, that of course did happen. That's why we're looking at these. But we're still on SPARS. And where I left off was a comment that I was making. Just in this document, they're talking about the problem of this Colosevir vaccine that they're promoting, really having some detrimental side effects that people are noticing, the public is noticing, and it's being spread on social media, and that's a problem. The problem isn't that people are having the adverse side effects, it's that they're talking about it, is what this document is saying, which is a bit concerning. And here's something that I thought was interesting where I had left off, and again, this document is from 2017. Repurposing hashtags like Black Lives Matter, some African American communities began to actively campaign against Coravax. So it's almost as if they knew Black Lives Matter was going to be a big part of our current social milieu. Here's some communication dilemma that follows each chapter, just talking about meeting communication needs. And question 1 here. In an increasingly interconnected global communication environment, how could U.S. health officials be better poised to explain the rationale for their continued recommendation of the U.S.-based Coravax vaccine when Japan regulations opt not to approve the vaccine? Very interesting, because we are seeing that happening here. We're promoting Pfizer and Moderna. Other countries are saying, we're not going to touch that stuff. That's been literally banned in other countries because it's been determined to be unsafe, because they are actually accepting the reports of the terrible side effects that people are experiencing. So they anticipated that and are saying, how do we convince people to still take this vaccine that is producing these terrible side effects when other countries aren't taking it? And one motivation for that could be that they want to keep the money in their pockets with Pfizer and Moderna. They don't want to use any vaccinations developed by other entities. Chapter 16 is called Antibiotics Ho. Start from the top of this paragraph, a little more lengthy. To reach members of these groups. What groups? The demographics of people that they're trying to convince. So to reach members of these groups, which with the exception of the pocketed communities were largely spread throughout the country, the U.S. government added a new aggressive advertising campaign in its pro-vaccination efforts. We're seeing a hell of a lot of that. This campaign provided targeted internet advertisements to individuals as they conducted web searches or visited anti-vaccination websites. If someone searched Google for Coravax side effects, for example, a sidebar advertisement appeared on the results page explaining the benefits of the vaccine. Again, we see that, unless you're living under a rock. Likewise, if someone wished to view the Colosevir vomiting video on YouTube, they would first have to watch either a montage of pictures illustrating the effects of SPARS or a clip of Paul Farmer's explanation of Coravax benefits. This advertisement campaign required government officials to leverage relationships in the information technology industry. Okay, so the government and big tech are really one and the same. They're combining in this effort to propagandize people. Yes, these terrible things are happening. Yes, people are vomiting, losing consciousness, and there are very real side effects. We're not going to allow you to explore that, though, because we've got something else that we want you to believe. While the federal government appeared to have appropriately addressed concerns around the acute side effects of Corvax, the long-term chronic effects of the vaccine were still largely unknown. Nearing the end of 2027, reports of new neurological symptoms began to emerge. After showing no adverse side effects for nearly a year, several vaccine recipients slowly began to experience symptoms such as blurry vision, headaches, and numbness in their extremities. And yet, I thought we were saying that these are adequately tested and proven safe. As these cases emerged, patients began filing for compensation under the PrEP Act due to the lingering uncertainties over possible links between vaccination and reported neurological symptoms. Their compensation requests were placed on indefinite hold. So when people start, so far this is fairly closely mirrored, sorry, this thing's wobbly, what we're experiencing in reality. So if that's the case, in about a year. Now, if the timeline for this SPARS drill lines up with our COVID experience, then we're going to start seeing really significant side effects manifest at about the turn of the year, maybe a couple months before that. And when they do, they're going to be placed on indefinite hold. They're not going to be heard. And we've got that legislation in place anyway, that act that had been passed to prevent pharmaceutical industries, vaccine developers from incurring any kind of financial damages per their liability, absolved of liability. Communicating with public, this is a communication dilemma following the end of the chapter. Communicating with the public about trustworthy sources of data and options for legal recourse in a climate of mistrust. How might advanced development and testing of recovery messages that specifically address the topics of adverse side effects and the NVICTF help improve health authorities' ability to respond to public distress about medical issues emerging after an MCM campaign? So in other words, how do we cover ourselves when the vaccine injuries inevitably emerge? It's like this whole drill is done with the foresight that there are going to be some significant injuries, and how do we deal with it? The primary message, this is nearing the end here, so acknowledging loss, I think, it's one of the final chapters. So people are literally dying. How do we deal with it? The primary message would be one of gratitude to so they're talking about how do the authorities communicate their condolences, or how do they deal with this happening? The primary message would be one of gratitude to the American people for remaining strong during the pandemic. Another key message would convey appreciation for adhering to public health recommendations, including vaccination, to hasten the end of the pandemic in the face of considerable uncertainty. So again, this is a study on how to manipulate minds when they roll up the COVID pandemic, is what I interpret it as. So far, SPARS has really closely matched with what we're experiencing. So again, to me, if we start to see these adverse injuries and deaths occur, which we have, and they actually begin to acknowledge them because they become too plentiful to ignore at some point, the message is going to be, thank you so much for doing your duty. You're a true patriot. This is just a necessary thing that has to happen in order to save the planet. And people will go along with it because of that aforementioned Stockholm Syndrome. When you've got people who are paralyzed from the waist down, or they've got Guillain-Barré or a beret or whatever, another paralysis side effect, and literally dying. But the people who haven't died, who are still alive, I mean, the paralysis thing throws me for a loop. You got somebody who can no longer walk saying that this is really a great thing and I condone it with all my heart. The brainwashing is real. Communication dilemma. Bringing a sense of resolution to a period of crisis while striking a balance between the need to affirm collective grief and loss and the need to move forward. So how do we make people continue with the vaccination even after they learn it can injure them? And in the aftermath, chapter 19, probably the last one, I'm not sure yet. The pandemic officially ended in August 2028, but the virus persists in domesticated animal reservoirs. In domesticated animal reservoirs. So maybe we can anticipate that when they say, all right, we've been alleviated of the pandemic now, or at least it's on the decline. But domesticated animal reservoirs would be, I don't know how else to interpret that, but like farms, cows, sheep, I don't know. Is this an attack on farming? We do see Bill Gates buying up all the farmland. We hear this in the globalist narratives that we need to stop eating meat. Having animals is bad for the environment. They fart after all, and that is destroying the climate. Things they literally say that people are somehow believing. So is this a narrative that they're going to begin to seed into the public psyche, that these domesticated animal reservoirs are dangerous, could result in another outbreak, so we need to eradicate them? I don't know. I hope not. And they anticipate that future outbreaks will continue to emerge unless countries maintain widespread vaccination coverage. So it doesn't matter, once this pandemic subsides, we're going to need to keep going with this vaccination protocol. A lot of money to be made there. Conspiracy theories also proliferated across social media, suggesting that the virus had been purposely created and introduced to the population by drug companies, or that it had escaped from a government lab secretly testing bioweapons, like Wuhan, which it did. I've got a document to prove that, as a matter of fact, which we will address later. Actually, I think now they're just releasing this in mainstream media. And so that means it's true officially, even for people who don't know how to think for themselves. Now that the news said it, it's real. So conspiracy theories that it originated from a lab that was studying gain-of-function research. Well, that is what happened. I was talking about this earlier today with somebody, and I could tell that the response was not one of belief, for sure. And that's, people are going to look at you sideways, and the only thing you can do is console yourself with the knowledge that it's true. And when you can put the pieces of the puzzle together, when you can see the writing on the wall, you're not just absorbing a mainstream regurgitation from your television, that magic box in your living room that is the fount of all knowledge and can guide you into truth. It's really hard when you take all that information and put that at the forefront of your mind to determine that, well, maybe it's not true after all. But I acknowledge that that's a real threat. And I've always said that we can't begin to let this feel natural. That would be our undoing, because this is how lasting systematic changes for the worse have taken hold. It's removal of freedoms incrementally. It's that frog boiling in a pot. Put a frog in a pot of lukewarm water and slowly turn it up by degrees. Once it adapts to a higher degree, then you can turn it up higher, and it won't notice until the water's boiling and it's dead. That's kind of what it is. So they may alleviate some of these restrictions, but they're just going to come back. And I'm just looking at my notes at the end of this. Oh, we are seeing, so people are breaking out in rashes, which is herpes zoster, following the Moderna shot. Convulsions, loss of consciousness, that's happening. We are seeing casualties. They're not mass casualties. Most people who've been vaccinated, they got real sick. Some of them really, really sick. Some of them have died. I've heard several people say they know someone who has died. More people that, I've heard more people say they know someone who has died shortly after getting the vaccine, whether it's Pfizer or Moderna, than people who have said that they know someone who has died of COVID. Interesting. And I refer again to the data from the CIA World Fact Book. The death rate, if we were in the world's biggest pandemic since the bubonic plague, then we would see quite a difference in the death rate, which we don't. So that wraps up SPARS. I think there's reason for concern. I thought about maybe jumping into Event 201. I don't see why not. I already kind of did. But Event 201. So this is a global pandemic exercise. Like I said, October 18th of 2019. And apparently our people became aware of COVID-19 in December of 2019. So possibly not even a full 2 months later. They're talking about, says experts agree that it's only a matter of time before one of these epidemics becomes global. Yes, 2 months to be exact. Again, interesting timing. Recommendations. The next severe pandemic will not only cause great illness and loss of life, but could also trigger major cascading economic and societal consequences that could contribute greatly to global impact and suffering. The Event 201 pandemic exercise conducted on October 18, 2019, vividly demonstrated a number of these important gaps. The Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, World Economic Forum, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation jointly proposed these recommendations. These are the entities that really form policies and legislation that the government is adopting this research and basing what they are doing, what they're enacting on it, because they all work in conjunction. For instance, companies with operations focused on logistics, social media, or distribution systems will be needed to enable government's emergency response, risk communications, and medical countermeasure distribution efforts during the pandemic. So they're talking about how just logistics, how do we deal with this? Here they're talking about a virtual stockpile model that could be expanded to augment WHO's ability to distribute vaccines and therapeutics to countries in the greatest need during a severe pandemic. This should also include any available experimental vaccine stockpiles for any WHO R&D blueprint pathogens to deploy in a clinical trial during outbreaks in collaboration with CEPI, Gavi, and WHO. So we need an experimental vaccine stockpile to deploy in a clinical trial. Well, that's exactly what we have. When you go to take the vaccine, you're participating in that stated clinical trial because it has not had a human trial. It's an experiment. You're the experiment. Improved decision-making, coordination, and communications between the public and private sectors relating to risk, travel advisories, import and export restrictions, and border measures will be needed. Ministries of health and other government agencies should work together now with international airlines and global shipping companies to develop realistic response scenarios. And we have it says here, blah, 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 government subsidies to support critical trade routes and potentially liability protection in certain cases. Already, they're on top of that liability protection right away. Government should provide more resources and support for the development and surge manufacturing of vaccines. Therefore, the ability to rapidly develop, manufacture, distribute, and dispense large quantities of MCMs will be needed. This will require addressing legal and regulatory barriers, among other issues. How do we skirt around the law to make this happen? A severe pandemic would greatly interfere with workforce health, business operations, and movement of goods and services. Not really the pandemic, it's the lockdowns that interfere with that. Again, just going by the death rate, it's not a pandemic. We have seen those consequences, economic consequences, That doesn't come from the pandemic, though. That comes from the lockdowns. Much of the economic harm resulting from a pandemic is likely to be due to counterproductive behavior of individuals, companies, and countries. Again, no, that comes from government-instituted lockdowns. Again, if your TV wasn't telling you there was a pandemic, you'd have no idea. Any of the economic fallout is from the government. It's not from the people. I like how they try to stick that in there. It'll likely come from behavior of individuals, companies, and countries. That's the problem. Okay. But there'll also be a need to identify critical nodes of the banking system and global and national economies that are too essential to fail. Too essential, like Amazon. Not so much the small businesses. Governments and the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat mis- and disinformation prior to the next pandemic response. That ever-present hyper-focus on how can we ensure that we are the arbiters of truth and minimize interference with that total truth domination entirely. Governments will need to partner with traditional and social media companies to research and develop nimble approaches to countering misinformation. This will require developing the ability to flood media with fast, accurate, and consistent information. Fast, accurate, consistent information. Flood the media with it. Propaganda. Public health authorities should work with private employers and trusted community leaders such as faith leaders to promulgate factual information to employees and citizens. Trusted, influential private sector employees should create the capacity to readily and reliably augment public messaging, manage rumors and misinformation, and amplify credible information to support emergency public communications. National public health agencies should work in close collaboration with the WHO to create the capability to rapidly develop and release consistent health messages. For their part, media companies should commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and that false messages are suppressed, including through the use of technology. Interesting that they're not just concerned with getting their narrative out. They keep on saying to do it quickly, to do it rapidly develop and release consistent health messages, flood the media with fast, accurate, and consistent information. That's a propaganda tool, to do it rapidly, to flood, to repeat the message, to get it out and out and out and out. That's how you sway minds, basically. You take control of people's minds by really not allowing them to have time to think critically. Remember, Time magazine, I believe it was, said that